Okay, this is week 4, and this is lecture 4, and we're going to continue to pick up what we talked about just a little bit ago. And what we talked about is what happens when you begin to turn loose and invite people to imagine the giftings and graces that God has given them to fulfill the purposes for which He has created them. It's an incredible way of really thinking about leadership. Okay, so I want you to think in terms of this. What if, as a senior leader, we're not controllers, we're not managers, we're not determiners of the organizational status, but instead we are what I call imagination evokers. What if we exist to give people the capacity to reimagine a future different than the present? See, in the modern worldview, in the prescriptive worldview, there was a bind on creativity and imagination because the world was already predictable. You could already understand the outcomes. It required engineering, math, and algorithms. It wasn't about the capacity to be creative, beauty, like Keating said in the last one that we just talked about, beauty, romance, and love. It's not about this redemptive, beautiful vision that we can't control or manipulate, that we have to step in and dance around and find ourselves. What happens if missional leaders are those who have this incredible capacity to invite their people to dream differently, to imagine their place in this world differently, that they rip off the ceilings and the lids that keep people constrained from fulfilling the purposes for which they've been called, and we utilize the text of Scripture to do that. That's why in this week you're writing a scriptural narrative that defines the missional church. I want you to begin to think in terms of Scripture. Like, how does the Scripture invite us to pull back, to draw out, to help people imagine what their role in what God is calling them is going to be? There's 3 particular stories that I love when it comes to this. Story number 1 would be the story of Philip. What if you could utilize the story of Philip as a way to invoke missional imagination within your people? This guy who had missed the original cut of being one of the apostles, but then who was chosen to be a deacon, but who then finds himself as a result of the diaspora of Acts, this persecution that comes upon the Jerusalem church, spread out, and he finds himself Samaria. God uses him in a powerful way to ultimately shape the entire Samaritan community as they come to Christ. But then he finds himself led by the Spirit out to a desert road in which up ahead of him, he sees this eunuch being carried in a chariot of the queen, right? And so the Spirit says, go up, run alongside of them. And what have you helped your people to say? That's what your life is about. It's about listening to the Spirit and running up alongside of those down the road that God might be calling to you, that you know your story well enough so that when you stand alongside, when you walk alongside of those people who are inquisitive, who are seeking, and they invite you up into the chariot, that then you can crawl up into that chariot with them and begin to share the hope that God has for you. What if we begin to help people understand within the context of the Scriptures that is their role, like that they are infused with the possibilities and the potentialities and the capacities to live out this life faithfully, to listen to the Spirit, to run up alongside, and to then invest their lives in those who are inquiring about what all of this life means and what all this spiritual faith means. What if we help them do that? The other one I love is out of the book of Acts, in chapter 11. It's the Antioch church. Now, the Antioch church is this incredible church that God uses throughout history. It's probably one of the most top 5 of all important churches throughout the history of the church because of what comes out of that. It's the sending ground for Paul and Barnabas. But do you know who plants the church in Antioch? No, you don't. Because in chapter 11 of Acts, it just simply says some brothers from Cyprus and Cyrene. See, when you can invite people to think that the command and control structure doesn't have to mean that the senior leader controls and determines every activity, but empowers the people of God to do what God is calling them to do, you might find that there are fresh expressions of ministry happening out and away from you that you had no role or control in shaping and forming. As the leader, I don't have to determine what those next steps are going to be. That God may be inspiring and motivating and creating creativity in the minds and the hearts of people so that someday there's just some brothers and sisters from Cyprus and Cyrene or from Chicago or wherever you're located who have done this fresh new work of God, and they can't trace its origins back to any command and control structure. I love it because the people from Jerusalem, the Jerusalem church, had to send people up there then to figure out like what is going on, because we didn't commission this, but God did. See, when we remove the barriers, the creative lids, right? And we can invoke in them the ability to dream and imagine and think about what God could do in and through them. It sets off and ignites in them a passion to be used, and fresh expressions of ministry can come as a result of that. The third story is this. I love the story of Philip and Nathanael, the story in which there's this call, hey, come, follow me. And Philip goes and grabs Nathanael. Nathanael goes, who are we following? And Philip says, the Messiah. And he's, where's he from? And I love this. He goes, from Nazareth. And then Nathanael goes, is anything good come from Nazareth? How many of our people in especially urban contexts and broken situations think there's nothing good that can come from here? All that ever comes from here is bad. What if you begin to help them imagine that the very epicenter of all the redemptive change that takes place in this world comes from the backwoods, cross the tracks, nobody valued kind of place like Nazareth? What if you begin to help people imagine the capacity of maybe their broken situation, their backwoods, their across the tracks kind of place became the epicenter of God? What if you help them to reimagine their location, their context, their place, and you begin to say, what if this is precisely the kind of place that God would use the foolish to shame the wise, the weak to shame the strong? What if this is the kind of place? See, when you begin to help people imagine in their context, in their abilities, what God has called and created them for to do, it just tears off the lids and it sets them free to be able to fulfill God's purposes for their lives. That's a different way of leading, though. It's not a top-down leadership. It's an invitation to a group of people to lead together. And so I can't control that. I can't manage that. So I have to stand alongside of those who have gifts unlike me, who we share in this leadership together. It's what J.R. Woodward calls polycentric leadership. It's a kind of leadership model in which leadership is diffusive or dispersive. It goes out and filters throughout the organization. Authority and power is filtered out through the organization. And yes, it can get extremely messy, but I would rather have messy and faithful than control and idolatrous, right? And so we have to recognize that within the leadership potential, there's always risk, but that risk could ultimately end up fueling these incredible missional endeavors that challenge our assumptions based upon what we think we can control and manipulate. We're going to come back in chapter 5 or in lecture 5 and sort of sum all this up.